Now, we rely on nature to provide us with food, water, shelter, and so on. Therefore, making nature an asset just as produced capital like roads, buildings, and human capital such as health knowledge are assets. However, nature is more than an economic good. Many value its very existence and recognize its intrinsic worth too. Biodiversity enables nature to be productive, resilient and adaptable. We now want to have a discussion on the economics of biodiversity, and joining me via Zoom is Dr. Philip Osano, who is the Africa Center Director at Stockholm Environment Institute. And also here in studio we have Peter Odhengo, who is a climate finance expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on Bottom Line Africa. Now I'll start with you, Dr. Philip. Biodiversity is declining at a very fast rate. Talk to us about that.
Thank you so much, Ashley. A number of studies by scientists through a process called the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity has indicated that over the last 50 or so years, the rate of biodiversity decline has increased substantially. And this is actually attributed to also the way we conduct our activities, our economic activities. One of which has got to do with what you have just mentioned, I think, in the news. You just talked about this Guinea and DRC being put on high alert by WHO on the Ebola. The contribution of diseases like Ebola and COVID-19 are coming because of our much closer interaction with nature, and particularly the interaction between wildlife and human beings, which leads to increases in zoonotic diseases. So changes in the way we manage our land and also the way we use our sea resources has emerged as one of the contributors to biodiversity loss. But we also have other contributors, for example, pollution. You've also just reported about this study on pollution and the levels of death that we get from pollution. So pollution is also one of the causes of biodiversity decline that we are witnessing from our research. And obviously a bigger issue has got to do with spread of invasive species. Most of you might be aware, for example, in Lake Victoria, with the problem and challenges we've had with water hyacinth. And there are quite a number of other invasive species, whether they're animals or plants, that are getting into our system. But because they're not really they're not endemic to our natural environment, they then become difficult to control because we don't have natural predators to control them. And lastly, and most importantly, is also the climate change. So climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss.
All right, Peter, coming to you, it has been mentioned that we have collectively failed to engage with nature sustainably. Then how do we therefore need to engage with nature sustainably?
Thank you very much, Ashley. The failure in the past for us to engage with nature sustainably is as a result of the limited knowledge on how to value nature. If you look at the way the world economies have been structured, they are structured within the physical and monetary aspects of it. Biodiversity, as has been mentioned by Philip, water, forest, the insects, all that what is under the soil, has not been ably quantified and monetized. So it is based on this that we see the biodiversity as just a free good. That being the case, the GDPs that we are using today to calculate our potential in terms of economics and how we compare the strength of economies from various countries does not factor in this key important value of nature. It is on that we have seen this destruction to this level. But just to put a point in it, over the last 10 years, as a result of attempts both at the policy level and also to mitigate the impacts and adapt to climate change, countries which have conserved their nature, like Brazil, Costa Rica, they have already come up with mechanisms through which nature-based and nature capital can now be calculated, and now use those ones within the REDD+ investing frameworks. And those countries have seen increased conservation of nature and that economics of biodiversity is now the in thing, and going forward, building back better after post-COVID, we must look how to integrate the wealth indicators in calculating our GDP so that we can appreciate it, that it is not valueless.
All right. Dr. Philip, talk to us about the institutional failure. There seems to be widespread of institutional failure. What exactly is the implementation gap?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues that comes with institutional failure is the fact that what my colleague Peter has just mentioned, we do get benefits, different sorts of benefits from biodiversity. Most of these benefits, some of them come as goods. For example, we talked about forestry. We get timber from forestry. We get fisheries from our lakes and oceans. And we also undertake tourism activities within different natural areas. Quite unfortunately, it is also the situation that most of this biodiversity are in places which are not under any sort of jurisdiction. An example is actually if you look at the world's oceans. So beyond what we call the exclusive economic zones, it is almost an open access system. So everybody goes there to harvest, and that's why you see that we've actually witnessed serious, massive overharvesting, overfishing in the world oceans, because we don't have a global institution that regulates fisheries harvesting in the oceans. But also, if you do come to one of the measures that we look at in terms of how we structure our ecosystem, and that's why it's very important that in this conversation we have economic planners and people who work in finance, like my colleague here, is we all look at progress based on the performance of the economy, which is the GDP. But that performance of the economy, as we look at it in terms of GDP, does not account for depreciation of nature. So when we harvest our timber and that goes into our economic accounts, we report that as progress. But what we've seen from our past research is that we organize our systems around what economists call capital. Mm-hmm. So we've invested heavily in what we call human capital, which is the health and education, for example, and also produce capital, which is basically infrastructure like roads, buildings, and so on. And we've got massive progress in those two areas of capital. But this has come at the expense of natural capital because we haven't been able to quantify the impact of natural capital. So the institutional requirement would be that we now start to invest in measures and indicators that would also not just account for progress that we make in terms of the health of the economy of the people and as well as education, but also in terms of what is happening also to our natural ecosystem. Because if you look at COVID, for example, mm-hmm. the cost that we are incurring right now in terms of dealing with COVID is actually a cost of inaction because we didn't invest a lot in terms of preventing the causes of COVID. And you see this with Ebola, and there are many other potential zoonotic diseases transferred between animals and human beings that might potentially come about if we don't invest in preventative measures.
All right, Peter, Dr. Philip has talked about issues to deal with the ecosystem, issues to deal with overfishing, but then there's also from tropical forests to coral reefs, which have already been degraded beyond repair, and they're being termed as tipping points. So then these tipping points could have catastrophic consequences, especially to our economies. Talk to us about those consequences to the economies, not only in Kenya, in Africa and beyond.
As you are aware that the ecosystems are interconnected.
Yes.
Water, marine, freshwater, marine, terrestrial, and also within the atmosphere. If you look at the food that we eat, and if you look at the fish that we fish from rivers to the oceans, and if you look at what we get from the forest, all the goods and services that we are today using are in one way or another originated from nature, mm-hmm. including even the fossil fuel that you've ably indicated as the main killer of the human being. This interconnectedness, things have changed since 1985 when the first Brundtland report was released on the need for the consumption of countries and nations to change from and sustainable nature of consumption to the sustainable way through which we have a balance between nature and also other aspects of the biosphere. In this regard, that interconnectedness is the way we link between these products and also the goods and services. But biodiversity is the core and the pillar and the fulcrum of this sustainability. The degradation that we have seen in our oceans and also within our forests here, if you take, for example, Mau, the effect of water hyacinth, is so serious, but we have not been putting measures to clean them up or to restore them. Because nature, once you've destroyed nature, nature takes millions and billions of years to come back to its original state. But if we want to fast track and accelerate that rejuvenation of nature and put it within our ecosystems, there are now new methods and new ways of how to deal with such and factor them within measuring our economy. Economics of biodiversity is very good for countries like Africa, where we do not have reach in materials, in technologies that make the capital, as my colleague Dr. Evans has said, to be counted as the developed. But if we can value our nature, if we can put a monetary aspect on our biodiversity, if we can conserve our wetlands, if we can value our forest, if we can value our tourism sectors, then we will be so rich that the rich countries that are coming here to say to laugh around us will also be here, come and now share with our this. So the time has reached with these policies that have been put in place, with the government coming up with green fiscal policy incentives that now will bring in, accelerate and catalyze transition towards low carbon, green economy, innovative economic paradigm shift. We have hope that we need to accelerate that to realize for the current and future generation if we have to be able to do the job.
All right, I'll leave it at that for now. That is Peter Odengo, climate finance expert, and Dr. Philip Osano, Africa Center Director, Stockholm Environment Institute. We continue with this conversation as it has been mentioned that once the nature is destroyed, it takes a while for it to go back to its original state. So then how exactly do we change our thinking, our actions as Kenyans, as Africans, and even the entire world? Will be coming back with those solutions shortly here on Bottom Line Africa. We take a short break. I leave you with Destination Africa.